Hello, I'm Professor Watson, and today we introduced simple neural networks, simple feed-forward neural networks. I wanted to do a video that kind of explains some of the intuitions behind neural networks. That's actually what my training is in. My background is I am a classically trained connectionist, which is what neural networks were called before they were cool. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how connectionism works, what neural networks are, and especially I come from a biological background. So I actually was working with, wet neural networks, actual, human brain neural networks, sort of, with actual neurons. And artificial neural networks actually began their life in the same way. So artificial networks were originally created by people who are psychologists and biologists and who wanted to use the intuitions that they saw being reflected in human and animal nervous systems and the kind of information processing that those systems did with a mathematical model. And so all of the intuitions for how neural networks work derive from that kind of biological model. And when you come in this from a computer science background, you're very often, you dive right into the linear algebra of it. You look at things like how can do learning with the Jacobian and things like that. And those are great things to know and very important fundamental parts of how artificial neural networks work. But it'll be very hard to remember or understand anything from that perspective because that's not what the system is modeling. The system is modeling actual neurons and their interconnectivity and the way that they communicate and talk to each other. And so if you don't understand that background, it's very hard to understand how artificial neural networks work. So I want to talk a little bit about biological neurons. Then I want to talk a little bit about how the metaphor of biological neurons is cashed out in the mathematical model of artificial neural networks. Then I want to draw some simple neural networks things that kind of teach you the pieces. The goal for this discussion isn't to get to the point where you understand how to build a neural network kind of from scratch. It's more so that you understand what parts a neural network is built out of. Very often, you will see these great figures of like the neural network zoo that has many, many, many representations of all these different neural networks, and they all have these different names and things like that. And that kind of stamp collecting is a little bit funny from a biological background because the basic intuition of neural networks is with some simple parts, with some simple neural units, and some simple rules for connectivity and some simple rules for learning, all of which are a bit malleable. There may be a few different kinds of neurons and a few different kinds of weights and a few different kinds of learning rules. Right? So there you have a few simple tools, but by recombining these simple tools, you can make a vast array of possible systems that do different kinds of intelligent processing. So the idea that you're going to kind of stamp collect and list out all the different kinds of neural networks, every single neural network is different. That's the point. The point is that you can build them so that they reflect an actual task that they are modeling and that they rewire themselves so that they are a perfect machine to carry out this task based on the data and the experience that they receive. Trying to, get the complete list written down kind of misses the point. It's like trying to write down the list of all possible species. I mean, it's not without value to document different kinds of species, but since we know about evolution, we know there are kind of as many species as you want you to be. At some level, all individuals are genetically different. At another level, we're all life is genetically related. And so the way in which you make the distinctions is a little bit arbitrary. It's a little bit, it's made up. It's a fiction. Neural networks are the same way. The basic rules of interconnected units are going to be the same for all networks, but we'll change activation functions, we'll change weights and architectures, and we'll change the learning rules. And we'll get different performances out and model different tasks. That's the core idea. So let's talk about those basic building blocks, and let's start from a biological perspective. So biological neurons. Okay, let's grab you. Yeah, there we go. Drag you down here. Okay, so suppose you want to draw a biological neuron. What's it look like? You start out with a cell body, right? And this is just like any other cell, has a nucleus, has all kinds of bits and pieces in it, different cellular organelles, different very elaborate biochemistry. But neurons are kind of unique in that they also have these kind of communicating processes. So there are very often branching off one then, these dendrites, which receive inputs from other neurons. They reach out and touch other neurons. And then this axonal process, which is a longer one that goes out. Actual biological neurons, this is the model that gets taught a lot to introductory neuroscience and psychology students. But actual neurons are a little bit more promiscuous about what counts as a dendrite and what counts as an axon. They mostly just have these sort of connecting processes. So you might have a group of neurons that are interconnected in this way, right? They have various long processes coming out. They branch back, they connect to each other. This one might go all the way back here and connect over here. And so we have all of these synapses where they're connected to each other. And this is how neurons actually look in tissue, except many, many, many more elaborate branching. A normal pyramidal cell will have thousands of branches, thousands of processes coming off of it. Something like a Purkinje cell will have tens of thousands of processes. So they're very heavily interconnected to each other. And they have many, many ways of, communicating in these synapses. One of the things I like to point out, because the gross analogy and therefore very memorable, is synapses are kind of the fundamental unit of processing in the brain. Right? It's this connection between cells where all the action is. The cells themselves are doing these, they have an internal state, they have a sort of electrical charge, and they are, as neurotransmitters are released from one cell onto the downstream cell, they destabilize this electrical charge, so you get more charge or less charge. And at some point, the cell will exceed a certain threshold and usually fire a kind of nonlinear response. Not all neurons fire nonlinear responses. Some of them fire a kind of ooze neurotransmitter, depending on how much the electrical charge there is inside the membrane. But most of them actually, kind of charge up and fire. So most of the interesting processing isn't taking place in that cell body, which is pretty much just charging up and deciding whether or not to fire. Most of it takes place actually in the synaptic connections. The gross analogy that I like to say is, if you take a real biological brain out of a skull, and you put it on a countertop, they're not actually solid. The ones you see are often filled with plasticizing chemicals, so they're very solid. But if you take a fresh one out, it'll just kind of settle into a pool over a couple of days, and then it'll start to rot and smell bad. And if you leave it for about a week, and you scrape it into a blender, and you run the blender so that it's all just a soup, so that you can't tell what this brain originally was. But if you scoop out a little bit of that soup and you put it on a slide, and you look at that slide under a microscope, you will still see the synapses stuck together like this. They are really, really durable. They're really stuck together. They're really carefully attracted to each other. And the strength of those synapses dictates a lot of how information passing works in this system. Strong synapses will cause the downstream neuron to fire more readily than weak synapses. And the tuning of those synapses is how biological neurons learn. So that's your introduction to biological neurons. It's a real cell. It is a cell that is kind of accumulating evidence, or accumulating this electrical charge, these ions, that will cause it to then fire off a response. Those fired off responses can then be passed to downstream neurons who are connected to it through these synapses. And these synapses can be remodulated and potentiated, made stronger or weaker on the basis of these electrical signals. That is how learning takes place in biological neurons. A great example of this, one that's one of the most familiar ways to get into this, is to say, okay, so at one end of this chain of neurons, you might have a special kind of neuron, a photosensitive neuron, that actually lives in your eyeball on the back on your retina right here. And these photosensitive cells, they actually have some dye molecules in them. And when light shines on those dye molecules, they start to break down. And the change in shape that is initiated by those dye molecules breaking down opens holes in those cells that allow these ions to flow in. And then those cells accumulate this electrical charge and signal downstream cells to that light hit them, right? That something happened, right? That's how photoreceptors work. And then those signals from photoreceptors in your eye go and impinge on these neurons lower downstream, and lo and behold, you have a signal that is passed your brain saying, hey, there's light out there. Hey, there's photons out there. Different color dye molecules actually detect different colors of photons and break down according to different patterns. So you can actually see a bunch of different colors and shades based just on those different colors of light. Incidentally, speaking of colors and shades, I just realized I should stop drawing in green and red. That's going to be confusing for at least some people. Fortunately, there's no meaningful distinctions between green and red on this chart right now, so things that matter are just the blue and the green. So how do we take this intuition of biological cells signaling each other with these electrochemical signals through these little synaptic connections and translate that into a kind of principled, more formal mathematical treatment? Well, neural networks attempt to do this, and they begin with a couple of concepts. So, artificial neural networks. To understand artificial neural networks, you're going to need a couple of tools. The first piece is a unit, what is called a neural unit, usually. And neural units are basically stand-in for the cells of neurons. They are this accumulator, this function that keeps track of how much ions, how much electrical activity has come into the cell. And so the way that this is typically going to be kept track of is we're just going to have for each of these cells an activation, a variable that is the activation of that. And typically we call that X. I'm actually going to draw this here. I'm going to try my best to make this legible. X, and we typically subscript it with I to just kind of count which neuron it is. So this is a cell. It's got a number in there. That number, that variable, is just changing on the basis of what kind of inputs are coming into this cell. So that's the first thing you'll need to know. Cells are these neural units. The second thing you might have is what we would call right here in blue a weight. This is a connection between a pair of cells. So I'd have one neural unit here, and then downstream I'd have another neural unit here, right? Let's call the variable in the second neural unit y sub I. And there's a weight connecting x and y, and we might call that weight something like w. And then we use post office rules. So we say, we subscript these with connections between the different layers. So we might say this is weight. Actually, let's make this I sub j. That way everybody is y sub j. That makes everybody kind of nice and unique. And so we would call this w I j, right? And this just says there are two neurons. Right? They are connected. There's xi and yi, and they are connected by this weight wij, which goes from xi to yj. Right? Very straightforward. Okay. The next thing you'll want to understand is the idea of an activation function. An activation function is it is a function that relates different neural units. Right, so every unit actually has an internal activity, right? And we are going to pass inputs through some activation function to determine that internal activity. This is something that I think is very straightforward from a biological perspective, right? I'm going to send in a bunch of neurotransmitters over these synapses. Some of them might be excitatory, some of them might be inhibitory, some of them will make me want to fire, some of them will make me not want to fire, some of them might just be modulatory, like they'll change my sensitivity to different ones, right? So there's all this information that's coming in. It gets integrated together, and all of it gets added up in some way by the cell, and the cell either activates or it doesn't, right? Now, in artificial neural networks, this can get a little bit kludgy and a little bit funny, because very often there will be things that are not really described as activation functions that are different layers and things like that. There's a lot of complexity there. But I want to cut through a lot of that complexity and say, okay, look, there is a simple activation function that is relating the activity of y. Go back to writing in yellow here. So we have the activity of y sub j, and that is going to equal some pattern of activation over some function of x and w. X of I and w ij, right? Now, let's talk about some common functions, because it's actually really helpful to see an example here. So the most common function is a simple summative linear activation function, which basically means we are going to take cell y sub j, and we're just going to add up 1 to n for every cell, for every x, right? We are going to we're going to multiply the weight ij times x's activation, oftentimes adding a bias terms. And I'm just going to use c here for constant or bias term. And sometimes you will typically have biases at the level of a layer, so I'm just going to use one layer here, but you could have a subscript here too if you wanted. Typically biases are layer-wise rather than unit-wise, but you can have unit-wise biases as well. So this is just really simple. This is just like a linear regression function. If you were to plot this, y is going to be related to just the sum of the product of these weights times j. It's going to be some linear function like this. Right, this is a very common activation function. Linear activation function, perfectly good. And all we're saying is, hey, look, it's the product of the weights times the product of the activations in the previous layer. So every cell, just like in these neurons up here, every cell is passing some information forward to the next cell. And what signal is it passing? Well, it's going to pass a signal whose strength is proportional to the activation in the first layer, in the X layer, times the connectivity strength between the X layer and the subsequent layer. Right? So this is basically a simple thing that's going on. Now, there is a whole zoo of different activation functions that you might modify this connectivity with. And I'll go through a couple of them pretty straightforwardly here. So one of the ones that is actually really useful, this is just a pause on the side. Take a minute to just kind of convince yourself about the linear thing before we move on to the more complex activation function. You should be able to picture, right, a bunch of neurons, and I'll draw a little array up here like this. Okay, here's our X layer, and they're going to connect to this Y layer, like this. And they could have all kinds of complex connectivity like this. This is a dense layer where everybody's connected to everybody. And for each one of these, here's our x's. We're going to go down the list. We're going to say, okay, this first y, okay, its activation depends on this first x times the weight connecting them, plus this x times the weight connecting them, times this x times the weight connecting them. Okay, that's our activation. We add all those up. That's our activation for 1. These are sometimes called sigma units or sum units, summative neurons, because they add up all their activations. Very simple. Okay, so what are other things that you could do? What are other activation functions that would work here? Okay, well, there's a couple of obvious examples. So I could take this linear thing and I could pass it through another function. So I could use one of the ones that's very common map or link function that you would use here is a sigmoid function. And that's because the sigmoid function constrains all the values between 0 and 1. If you're going to have thousands of these neurons, you don't want to be adding up thousands of activations times thousands of large weights. You would get this, kind of overflow errors in these huge numbers. One of the ways to constrain that is pass everybody through a sigmoid function. So the sigmoid looks like this. That's sometimes called the sigmoid squashing function. Right, and it's nice smooth things. It saturates at 1 and 0 down here. And so you can just take this linear function and wrap it in a sigmoid, and that'll keep it from getting overflow errors. So that would look something like y sub j is just the sum. It's just sigmoid squashing function of the sum of wi j xi plus some constant. Okay. Straightforward. Wash it through a sigmoid function. There are other fun functions. There's one function that's in broad use right now called the ReLU, or the rectified linear unit. It's a unit that is linear above 1, or linear in the positive domain, and 0 in the negative domain, whereas a traditional linear unit would be negative in the negative domain. This prevents some problems that sometimes arise with units getting shut off or turned off permanently or something like that. The ReLU tends to avoid some of those problems. You might even have a leaky ReLU, which puts a little gap here, so you can have small negative values, but then your positive values are linear. Other fun functions, inverse tangent or arctan. Let me actually use a different color for that. How about orange? You can wrap it in an arctan formula. That'll get units to invert. You can do products of units. So there are actually some networks, especially attractor networks, that are called pi neurons because they are products, and you write a product with a big pi sign like this. So if you're using product units, again, let's use a different color, purple. Product units, we would write out the same function, but now y sub j is equal to product of the weights times the activations. These can often result in very fun behavior like flipping or oscillation, because if you have negative signs, if you have one negative sign in there, all of a sudden the response is opposite because you're multiplying all of those, and so those negative signs kind of flip each other. So those are interesting. The main thing but let's just focus on the simple linear activation function for now. The main thing to know is just there are lots of ways that you can change the response each individual unit in a network will have by changing up the activation function. And neural networks, when they are assembled out of these different tools, will often use different activation functions in order to get out different behavior. Many neurons use, especially in recurrent networks that allow cells to connect back to themselves so that they have a memory and they can keep track of things over time, will have some special rules in their activation function. They might even have kind of logical activation functions that say, keep this activity signal around over this interval of time unless you receive this input which tells you to let that one go. A neural network called an LSTM actually uses those kinds of memory units that kind of lock on their memory functions. And these activation functions are one of the core elements that you'll need to know to understand neural networks. Okay, so those are our basic ideas. We have neural units, we have weights connecting them, and we have activation functions that determine how they integrate the signal and what the internal activation of each cell is given its inputs and given the weights of them. Okay, there are about 2 more things that I think are critical to understand in neural network, in how neural networks work. So the next thing is, we usually refer to these. This is something that you can probably infer at this point, which is the architecture. Different architectures. So this is just kind of different kinds of connectivity. I drew a really simple one up here where the 2 cells are connected. This is another one where they're kind of connected like this. They're densely connected. But you can do all kinds of stuff. You could have what are called dropout layers. And this is where only some of the cells are connected. Like this. They're a little sparser. They're not connected super dense like this. You could have networks that split, and different elements of the network do different things. You might have some input units that connect over to another layer up here. And these two connect up here. And then this one connects over to this layer down here. But then these ones connect up to, all of these then connect to this other layer over like this. So now there's, you know, these two different tracks. So these are almost like two separate inputs, two separate networks coming in. Other interesting architectures that you might have. I've already mentioned the one that is recurrent architectures, where you connect back to yourself, right? It contains cells that connect back to themselves and therefore hold memories of their past states. There are architectures that we call deep architectures because they have many, many layers. So you'd have, you know, instead of just having units connect kind of to one layer, they have very, very many layers like this. There are all kinds of stuff. There are even architectures that include other kinds of algorithms, other non-neural network algorithms. A good thing about this is like a differentiable Turing machine, which is a Turing machine that is all that, you know, there's a working computer in there, but there's also neural units in there. And so you are using the kind of floating point arithmetic of a Turing machine to actually go and look up which neuron you want to trigger. So there are a lot of architectures that are very creative. And these are essentially the parameters inside of a neural network. Okay, so now we're talking about inside a neural network. What can these things do? How do we connect them? You know, we started out with this example of an eyeball, and maybe at the end of this we have, you know, a hand that has some sort of reflex, like catching a ball or something. All right, so we had these input-output relationships. How can we reflect that input-output relationship? So let me add another page here. Meet me down here. Okay, so there's two more things that we need to do, and then let's start getting into some of the ways to make this more mathematically sweet and to represent this to yourself mathematically in a way that you can then kind of do operations on. So the first thing that we do is like, let's make a simple network with a simple input, a simple output, simple connectivity, write down all the functions. We can make this really easy. So one of the things that we'll need to have is, let's have our input, right? And again, I'm going to call this x, and there's only one of them right now, but we could imagine that there were more, so we could have x sub I. And we often call this input layer something like I, right? So this refers to all of the cells in that layer. Note that you can write down all of the cells in that layer in vector form by writing something like big X, right? So this would be a list, a 1 by n vector, where this is x sub 1, x sub 2, x sub 3. All right. I'm just going to draw one of them for now, but just keep in mind that you could write down, there could be many of these, right? So this is our input layer, right? So then we're going to connect our input layer to our first hidden layer. All of the layers that aren't directly exposed to the inputs or the outputs, we tend to call hidden layers because their processing is hidden from the input and the output, right? If you looked at this whole thing as a black box, there would be some activation being passed around in there, but you wouldn't know what it is. All right, so in this simple feed-forward network, let's make our first hidden layer here, and let's call this HA for hidden layer A. Right, and again, our activations, we can refer to our activations. So this is activation A sub 1. Let's call this x1 here. And A sub 2. Right, so we have a couple of cells here that are connected to the first one. And so now we can draw our, okay, so this is our weight 1, 1, right? And you sometimes can even put a little superscript here, which would be something like I, H, A, or actually let's leave the H out of it and just say this is IA, right? So we're saying, okay, so this is the weights. They connect the input layer to the layer A, right? And it's from unit 1 to target 1, right? From 1 to 1, right? Similarly down here, we could say weight 1, 2, and again IA, right? So we now have these individual weights. So far we've been tracking these individually, but again, let's use our vector formulations down here. So down here we have HA, right? Just to make this, I'm going to try and make this as clear as possible. So I'm just going to say, okay, there's only one in this, only one X in this one right now, but in HA here we can have A1 and A2. Okay, let's keep going. I'm going to connect the whole thing up. I'm going to wire the whole network together. All right, so here is our next layer. This is B. Now our connectivity is a little bit more complex because we're going from 2 units to 2 other units. Here's B1, B2, and then here is our output unit. And let's call that output unit Y1. Right? Again, we would probably call this output layer something like O for output. We'd probably call this second hidden layer something like HB. Okay, so now I've got all our units connected up. We could go through here and write all of the weights. So this, for instance, would be weight AB 1, 1, from 1 to 1. Right? And doing all that, we could get this all indexed out. But this would be a very inefficient and, in fact, kind of confusing way to write out all of this stuff. Because, again, we have this vector representation. So we could have, here is the activations of our units. B1, B2. And here's the activation of our output. Let's just call that our Y's. Because, that's our Y. That's what we're trying to predict. Y1. Okay. So this is our connectivity diagram. Very simple network, very simple message passing. But how did the messages actually get passed? Is there any way that we can actually leverage the fact that these are vectors to pass messages? And the answer is, of course, yes, we can use linear algebra. So we can write down this weight matrix as a 2x1, right? A 2x1 vector where we write down the weights, right? And then if we took the dot product of this input, 1x2, with these weights, we would get the activation functions of this. Because remember, what our activation function, the way it works is, A1's activation is just equal to X1's, hang on, let's do it this way, Ij times X1, right? So it's just the weights that connect, this is a 1, 1 actually, plus some bias term, some constant. So we have this activation thing, but we could write this down in a more elegant way where we just say, okay, so the vector X times the weight matrix for this, and this weight matrix is going to look like this. Let's actually put this weight matrix over here. Let's do it this way so it looks just like we did it up here. So we can take our weight matrix WIA, and we multiply it by X, right, our activations, right? And that's going to be equal to HA, the activation of the hidden layer A, right? And similarly, we can now take the weight matrix here, and I'll draw these weight matrices in a second so that it's easy to see how they are represented. This is A to B, and we multiply that by HA, right? And that gives us our activation at HB. And so finally, we can multiply our weights from BO times HB. And that'll give us our output, right? And so the weight matrices here, we have this first one is just W11, W12. And then this one here is a 2x2. We've got W11, W12, W21, W22, and then down here we have W11, W12 again. And so we are, by multiplying these through, this one actually, hang on, maybe over here, so this one should be row-wise. So we multiply these weight matrices across, and just taking the product of these with these different cells, we go from here we have this 1 by 1, and we multiply it by this 1 by 2 to get this 2 by 1. We multiply that by a 2 by 2 to get a 2 by 1, and then we multiply it by a 2 by 1 to get a 1 by 1. Right? We map these through, and that's our output. right? Very straightforward, and what we're doing is exactly the same thing that we would be doing up here, where we'd be summing across the row and down the column, right? It's just that the matrix operation, the matrix multiplication, involves that across the row and down the column, right? So, you can think of these, I want to pause here and say, I often think of these using a kind of linear algebra analogy. I think of the activation of each layer as being a vector in some high dimensional space. And so it has some magnitude and it's pointing in some direction. And then I apply the weight matrix, which is a transform, which causes this vector in high dimensional space to pivot and point in a different direction, right? It might change it into a different magnitude, and it might even project it down or up onto a space of different dimensionality, right? Later on in class, we actually are going to talk about how to do projections like that. But for now, just, I'm going to keep things really simple and keep things to more or less the same dimensionality and just talk about rotation and change. And so that would, you can see how, okay, so we take this activation, we map it into this different space, we transform it into this different space, then we transform it again, and we transform it back to our outputs. Okay, this is all very cool. One of the things that I like to emphasize here is this simple model that we have up here actually has, if we were going to relate x and y, we would do so by writing down this very complex nested function, right? Where we would say, okay, so, y is equal to x, and then we apply to x the transform that is present in the IA transform. And then we apply to that quantity the transform that is represented by IB. And we apply to that, or AB. And we apply to that the transform that's represented by O. Right? So we're doing all this transformation, right? We're doing this big nested function. If you wrote this thing out in this format up here, it'd be very long indeed, right? It would be this very large list that's going through, that's summing across all these units and summing across all these units and summing across all these units. But, fundamentally, it's just a really long polynomial, right? It's not that weird, right? You just have this big high-rank polynomial that you're adding up. You're going through each of these steps, and you're adding up. You're getting new values at each by summing each level. You eventually come out at the end. You've got this quantity that relates your inputs to your outputs. Right. So now you have a function, right? This network kind of embodies a function that predicts y from x. And one of the things that I really like to stress at this point is it does so when you have random weights. This is before learning. This is before we've done anything fancy. When we just crack open a neural network, we already have, kind of embodied this elaborate function that takes an input vector, puts it through a series of transforms, and gives you an output vector. Right. Our task, therefore, with learning isn't to relate the inputs and the outputs. They're already related. The network embodies a relationship between those two things. Our task with learning is to take the relationship, the weird, random relationship that was initially embodied by this network, and change it through a series of tweaks to get it to have a relationship that we care about, right? So very often, and there's Rosenblatt actually did a proof on this, you can embody any function in a neural network of sufficient number of layers, and that layer number is 2, actually. And so with an input layer, hidden layer, and output layer, two weight matrices, you can approximate any function using this kind of, by putting together this kind of like large polynomial of all of these little sub functions. Right? So that's the kind of core logic of a neural network. We're going to multiply through this thing. We're going to take our inputs, multiply through by the weights, and we'll get the outputs. Okay. So there's one other piece. Oh, and just like we said with the activation functions, you could do some fancier stuff in here, right? You could say, okay, so we're going to have y equals the output, and then we're going to wrap that in the sigmoid. Hang on. And we're going to wrap that in this AB transform and blah, 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 right? So you can do all kinds of complicated things here if you so desire. There's one other thing, though, that I think is really important to helping understand the neural network. And it involves a fairly complex mathematical object called the Jacobian. But the Jacobian is really, really important to understanding how we are going to train neural networks, why it is the training of neural networks works, and what sort of guarantees exist on network training. And so I want to draw this out again. I'm going to take exactly this thing. This is the algorithm for kind of what we call the forward pass, which is just propagating signals through the network. And so now you should have the intuition about like what a neural unit is, how its weights are connected to another one, and how to do a forward pass, how to propagate signals through the network from one end to the other. Okay, so now I'm going to pop to the next level, and now we'll talk a little bit about the Jacobian and how we can construct a backwards pass, how we can construct learning rules based on that Jacobian. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit here. And I'm gonna just basically redraw my basic network here. So here's my input x, and I'll clean it up a little bit so it's a little easier to read. Okay, here's A, A1, A2, B1, B2. Make sure that Synapse makes it so this is a dense network. And then our output, Y. Let's put the labels for our layers here on again. That's I. Let's just call it big A, big B, and O. And again, here's our weight matrices. Weights IA, weights AB, and weights BO. And these are going to just be square matrices. Okay, so there's one other matrix here that is really important and really helps you understand what's going on. So from a learning perspective, what we want to know is we want to, remember, we have a function embodied by this network here that relates x and y, right? So we have so y is some unknown function of x and the parameters of this network, right? And we would like to choose essentially what this function is, or we'd like to approximate some function. Very often in neural networks, you are going to approximate some function that you don't know. So for instance, you have some data and you want to use the input data to predict the output data, but you don't know exactly what function relates the input data and the output data. Well, no problem, because of the following cool guarantee. Okay, so what you would want to know, what you would hope to find out is you want to know actually this quantity, dy dx. So you want to know the derivative of your output with respect to your input. You want to know basically when I change the input, what changes in the output. That's dy dx. That's the derivative of this function, this unknown function here. I can even call this f prime of x, using Newton's terrible notation for functions, right? So this dy dx, this is just the first derivative of this function, right? But this function is weird and hairy, and look at all this crazy stuff going on here. Okay. So there is this useful mathematical object here called the Jacobian. And a Jacobian, usually J, takes a function of some variables. Right? Let's call x1 and x2. Right? And it has all of the Jacobian is a matrix of the partial derivatives of each variable and of each function with respect to each variable, right? So let's clarify this a little bit. Let's zoom in on this example of input to A to do an example of this Jacobian. So we have this function relating x that A uses that puts A in terms of x, right? So A is this function. It's the weights times x equals A, right? So that's a function, right? A1, A1, 1, x1, okay? We have another function here, 1, 2. X is just simple polynomial functions. X1 equals A2, right? So we have two functions here. We have two variables here. Right? And so we could write down a matrix here, which is in this case it's because we only have they're only in one variable. They're only in x. Right? I said they're in two, but they're only in one variable with respect to it. So we could write down the derivatives of these functions with respect to a1. So we have the first function. Let's call this dA1 respect to dx and dA2 with respect to dx, right? So this is the Jacobian matrix that tells you how all of the variables in this second column here are affected by all of the variables in this first column, right? It relates all of the partial derivatives of all of the functions to all of the partial derivatives for all of the variables, right? We could write down a similar Jacobian. So this is for A, right? We could write down a similar one for B, and this one will be a little more complicated because remember in B we actually every B, right? We have W11 A1 equals, W11 A1 plus W21 A2 equals B1. And similarly for B2, we have W12 A1 plus the weight connecting 2 to 2 A2. Right, so B2 is the result of this function, right? So now we have two variables in two functions. So we need to write down a 2 by 2, right? And in this case, we're just going to have dA with respect to, dB1 with respect to dA1, dB2 with respect, dB1 with respect to dA2, dB2 with respect to dA1, and dB2 with respect to dA2. Right, and then finally we could write down this last layer here, and this we would write down as a 2 by 1 here, because now at this point we have two variables and one function, right? So y is B1 W11 plus WB2 1 2, or I guess 2 1 There's only one y. That's y1, right? And so we would write this down. Now we write this down this way. We say, okay, dy with respect to dB1, the derivative of y with respect to b1, and the derivative of y with respect to b2. Okay, so these are the Jacobians. This is a Jacobian form of these functions. And one of the really cool things about the Jacobians is that now we have kept track of all of the partial derivatives of every effect, that every change that is caused by changing any variable to any function for every variable. We wrote down the whole combinatorics, right? We just wrote down everything, right? We wrote down every possible combination of every possible pair of variables and every possible pair of functions, right? So this is it. These Jacobians, they capture all of the partial derivatives for this whole system with respect to everything that's going on. And so we can look at when we look at the Jacobians, when we look at this Jacobian form, that's all the changes that can occur to our system. We've written them all down, right? And if we take the product of those Jacobians, so if we just multiply them together, we do the dot product of them, right? What that means is we're going to be taking every possible change that could influence this first function with respect to the input variable times every possible change at the next layer, and similarly with respect to the second variable, we times every possible, we multiply across the row down the column, right? And we're looking at every possible interaction of every possible variable between these, and then we do the same for the outputs, right? So by doing the dot product of all the Jacobians, we're looking at all the possible interactions that can happen in this network, right? And so the outcome of that, right, if we're looking at all the possible derivatives, all the possible changes, and how they to every function by every variable, right? We multiply all of that out. What we get at the end is, of course, what we were looking for the whole time, which is this: the derivative of our outputs with respect to our inputs, right? Kind of exhaustively did all of the combinations of all of the different variables and functions that were going on inside our network. Okay, and this is great because it means that if we can approximate any of these Jacobians, right, then we can approximate what we wanted to all along. We can approximate the relationship between our inputs and our outputs. And the way that an algorithm like backpropagation of errors works is that it says, okay, I can compute the derivative with respect to, say, the outputs that is with respect to an error in our output. So if we measure our outputs and we get some error term, some mismatch to some target variable that we want to do if we're doing supervised learning, okay, so then we have this mismatch, we might call it delta, right? So this is the error. Right? We can attribute that. So we have this Jacobian matrix here. That means that tells us all the partial derivatives. So we can attribute to these different partial derivatives this error, right? And because remember, these are all really simple linear functions in the neural network, right? What is, it's easy to approximate these derivatives because, the derivative, these partial derivatives, because, the partial derivative of y, this dy db1, okay, well, we look at this equation, we say, okay, so what's the partial derivative of this? Okay, so it's with respect to b1, so we can ignore this part. I'll write this down here. So, our y is weight 1, b1, plus weight 1, 2, b2. Get rid of this guy. Okay. And that's equal to y1. Right. Well, if we do the partial derivatives, okay, we want to find dy b1, okay, well, we can exclude b2 because it's not in that, and it's just a linear combination of these two. And then, okay, so it's b1, let's do first derivative. Okay, we're just going to drop the power by 1 and multiply by 1, right? So it's just weight. It's just the weight. Right? And so we just have and so if we want to figure out how much of this is contributing, this weight is contributing, we just multiply the weight times the error, right? And that is the error value that we assign to this weight. So we say, okay, this weight is responsible for this much of the error, right? Now using that weight, we can also then attribute to B1, right? Propagating back through the network, we can attribute to B1 how much of B1's activation produced that error, how B1's activation contributed to the error, right? And so B1's activation is going to contribute to the error proportional to B1's activation, right? So then we can set these B1 variables, and then we can do the very same thing again. We can again solve for all these partial differential equations by propagating back these errors to the next layer, right? And we can assign, again, because the derivative of these functions is very, very simple, right? Because they're just these linear multipliers, right? And even if they were more complex, if we did something like wrap them into sigmoid, the derivative of each individual weight is going to be pretty simple, pretty tractable. It's a solvable thing, usually. Not always, and we'll talk about other means for approximating these values later on. But it's usually pretty solvable. It's usually pretty easy to approximate that value. So we can propagate the error back we can find out how much error, how much a delta E, let's call this weight contributed. And this weight, and this weight, and this weight, and this weight. And again, we plug those into these different equations, then we can figure out how much the activation of this contributed to the error of the network. And then we can go back with this. Okay, so we have now worked our way all the way back to the beginning, right? And we have assigned, we have approximated the effect, we have, because we have all these partial differential, these partial derivatives, we can plug in this error term to find out how much each of these weights contributed to the error. Because remember, the output of the system is just the product of all the interactions of all these variables in all these functions. So we can figure out how much of this error came from each weight in the network, and then we can tweak that weight to reduce the amount of error. Right? We can tweak it in the direction. If it was an overshoot, we can lower it. If it's an undershoot, we can raise it. We can add a little term here. And typically we also have a parameter here called the learning rate, a hyperparameter, that tells us how big a step we're going to make. Typically learning rates are small. They're like 0.01, right? So tweak by 1% of the error or something like that is what you might think of them. So we then, having computed this error matrix, right, which tells us kind of what is the derivative. You take the partial derivative with respect to the error for each of these weights. We can then plug in, multiply that and plug in our new weight. Typically we, say we have, our new weight, ij, is, let me write this in a little more legible spot. Our new weight ij is just our old weight, ij, plus delta ij times the weight. So delta E times the weight times our learning rate, and you often use lambda as a learning rate. So we have this is our update. So we can now update all of our weights. We can do that at each layer as we go back, and then our network should improve its fit of our inputs to our output to this unknown function that we were trying to approximate, right? So that is the basic idea behind a neural network. So now you should have everything you need to know, right, to basically interact with neural networks. You understand how they arise from biological neurons. You understand the basic components of them, which are the neural unit, the weight, the activation function, and the architecture, right? You understand a basic example of how these things ground out in a series of vectors and weight matrices. Vectors, which correspond to the units, and weight matrices, which correspond to the weights, the connectivity of the network. You understand kind of the notation of these different things and how you can leverage linear algebra to actually do these matrix multiplies, these inner products that will give you the next step in your network, in this feed forward network. Hopefully you even understand some idea, so you have some intuitions about how you can think of these things as kind of these vector transforms that are going on. Think of the activation at one layer as this elaborate vector in this high dimensional space pointing to someplace in high dimensional space, and you're mapping it, you're doing transforms on it as you go through. And also you understand how you might do learning on this, because learning in this case is just another way of talking about the derivative of the output with respect to the input. And that this can be captured by writing down all the partial derivatives with respect to each of these layers of the network. All right, that's just called the Jacobian. So you can write down this Jacobian for each layer of the network, and by plugging in the error term, by plugging in your mismatch to this system of partial derivatives, you can attribute how much of this error comes from each of these elements, because that's what the partial derivative tells you. That partial derivative tells you this is how much changing this unit, this is how much this connection, this function, this weight is responsible for changing this output unit, right? And using that, you can then propagate back through the network, updating each layer of weights with the appropriate partial derivative, right? Now, I've written this down here in linear form just to make this really easy, but you can imagine that if you knew the partial derivatives in your Jacobian, and it didn't happen to be this nice linear function, but it was something a little bit different, well, hey, no problem, right? You can use that partial derivative, and it still tells you the partial derivative with respect to these two units, and you can still plug your error term in there. It's just now you have a different formulation than this simple one that's just, updated based on the product of the weight and the error. You might have some other relationship between the weight and the error. That's fine. That would just be a different partial derivative. So you can represent, even very elaborate activation functions in this same system. And you have this lovely guarantee that the product of these Jacobians are going to give you out at the end this relationship between your inputs and your outputs. Okay, so that is how neural networks work. I probably in future videos will talk a little bit about more elaborate neural networks, but this I think is kind of table stakes ground idea of how to understand neural networks. And there's actually a lot of neural networks that you can work with and understand now, and you can do little extensions using this base knowledge pretty straightforwardly. Almost every kind of innovation in neural networks, even these really fantastic ones like GANs or sequence-to-sequence transformers that are getting a lot of press right now, that are really in the news, use a lot of this simple architecture under the hood. What they change up is the activation function. They change the learning rule, the way that they usually are approximating some of these partial derivatives, because they can't be solved really easily if they're using more elaborate activation functions. But they often find ways that they can sample from the distribution of those partial derivatives, and that allows them to approximate these quantities so that they can be approximately right. And they often are using the other thing to keep in mind is what are the inputs and the outputs, right? If you have clever ways of this network can represent any function. So if you have clever ways of relating inputs and outputs, right, that are maybe really opaque, the function is really opaque, we really have no idea what that function is like, well, no problem. You can use a neural network to approximate it. You can always use this trick. Statisticians hate him. One weird trick to approximate any function. That's kind of how neural networks work, and that's where a lot of the power of them comes from. A good example of a really weird function might be something like in reinforcement learning, where we're trying to approximate what the pattern of behavior we should do in this environment is to get rewards, right? Well, that's a function, right? And one of the big breakthroughs in reinforcement learning was learning that you could approximate utility functions with a neural network, right? So you could give it an environment and use the neural network to try to solve for what's the utility function on this environment. Lo and behold, this function, which is very hairy to write down and nearly impossible to derive because it involves all these conditional probabilities and it's stateful and it's very odd. Well, the neural network doesn't care. It plows right through it, right? Decomposes that function into lots of little bits. And this was, in fact, one of the original motivators for engaging with biological systems like this. Because the thing that biological systems do extremely well is take complex problems and decompose them into lots of tiny little simple subproblems. Just like we did decomposing this network into these individual, simple partial derivatives that we could use to derive the impact of a particular weight. When we zoomed into it, we had a very simple function, right? This thing that was intractable actually comes out to be, as simple as just multiplying the weight by the error, right? And biological systems work this way. Some of the original, one of the seminal books that I really encourage everyone to read, it's really eye-opening, is called Massively Parallel Distributed Processing by David Rumelhart and Jay McClelland. And it came out in the 80s, and it just talked about how to take these really complex problems and break them up into these tiny, tiny little subproblems, each of which could be solved by these biologically inspired neural networks, these artificial neural networks. And by breaking these problems down into these tiny, tiny tractable chunks, you could get this incredibly intelligent behavior that seemed to emerge from these relatively simple, dumb parts. And that was really the goal of those early, neural network connectionist investigators, of which I trace my kind of intellectual lineage back to. The goal was to say like, hey, when we look at the brain, we don't see a lot of complex computers in there. There's no CPU. There's no central processor. There's no smart software. There's just a ball of these little dumb neurons that seem to be doing this really basic signal processing. How could smart things arise from this? The answer was, hey, all smart things are composed of lots of little simple things. And so if you can figure out a systematic way to kind of guarantee to do this guarantee that we're looking at, where you guarantee that the simple little functions that you're summing together add up to something really interesting, hey, you can approximate anything. You can do any function, right? So anyway, that's neural networks for now. Later on, we'll talk about a lot of the caveats and a lot of the more complex neural networks. But I hope that this run-through has given you kind of a grounding to start thinking about how neural networks work and how you might use them in future projects. See you in the next video.